If you've ever thought of quilting your own projects but just don't know where to start, I have the perfect first steps for you. I've put together a PDF guide. I call it 3 Steps Toward Freehand Freedom. These are the baby steps, but they can help you move past your overwhelm and show you that yes, indeed, freehand quilting can be learned. So if you'd like to snag this PDF, there's a link in the show notes, or if you're an Instagram user, just message me 3 steps. That's the number 3 STEPS, and I'll send you that link. Let today be the day you get started.
I think that as you grow and develop and change and learn new things, you're adding skills and awareness and knowledge, and all of those things build on each other. So I think even if it's something you do that you don't like, well, that's important to know too, I'll never make a Dresden plate. I couldn't stand it. But, I think that everything you do, everyone you meet, it can lead to other opportunities.
Welcome to Measure Twice, Cut Once, the podcast where we hear quilters and other crafters' stories and draw encouragement and even life lessons from them. Joining me today to tell us her story is Lindsay McCrae. I'm your host, Susan Smith, and I'm coming to you from my quilting studio, Stitched by Susan. This is where my long arm Lucy and I spend our days doing freehand, edge-to-edge quilting. Now, if you're not a quilter and those terms mean nothing to you, it's basically doodling on the surface of a quilt with a 50-pound writing utensil, needle and thread attached, and at high speeds. And if you are a machine quilter, I invite you to tune in to the live and unscripted events that I host on my YouTube channel, also called Stitched by Susan. These happen on the first and third Friday of every month, and most often I am completing the long arm quilting of an entire project from beginning to end. So I invite you to kind of look over my shoulder as I do that project, as I encounter whatever challenges may be within it and talk my way through it. And these episodes, because they're streamed live, are also interactive, so you can ask questions and get answers about the project while I'm working on it. So once again, those happen over on my YouTube channel, Stitched by Susan, on the first and third Friday of every month. Today's Pins and Needles is brought to you by The Will and Dave Show.
Hi, I'm the Will half of The Will and Dave Show, a short little podcast that myself and the eponymous Dave like to record talking about the things that really matter to us, whether that's social, political, or pop culture. Usually we don't see eye to eye, but more often than not, we can find some common ground in there somewhere. And now, back to Pins and Needles with a quick tip for all you sharp quilters out there.
I've been working lately on neatly folding some of the fabric that I've maybe just kind of stuffed in my shelf when I get home from the fabric store. But I do love a neat stack of fabric so that I can see what I have in my stash. So I keep next to my fabric storage area a leftover cardboard insert from a bolt of fabric, and I know you can get these from any of your local fabric shops. They have tons and tons of them left over. So I just keep one next to my shelves, and for any piece of yardage that's over, maybe half or 3/4 of a yard, I do it on the floor. I lay my fabric out straight, and I put my cardboard piece on one end of it, and then I just flip one end over and then flip that little cardboard to roll it up as though it were a mini bolt. When you get to the end of your fabric, you can simply grasp the cardboard and slide it right out. And then I just fold it in half, and that shape and size fits beautifully on my stash shelf. And it keeps everything really organized. You can see a nice fold of each fabric as you're looking down over your library of fabrics. It's a beautiful thing. You know I love my coffee. I've got a steaming cup in my hand as we speak. If you're interested in supporting this podcast, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. There, for the price of one delicious coffee, you are able to make a one-time contribution. Thank you so very much for your support. And maybe take a moment now to refill your cup as you settle back to enjoy today's interview. My guest is Lindsee McCrae. Lindsay has a deep love for textiles of all kinds, and Feedsacks in particular. She shows them, speaks about them, and has written a book about them that has over 800 gorgeous images. It's my current favorite coffee table book. Lindsay has stories galore, both about her experiences and opportunities as a writer, and about the people and circumstances which made Feedsacks the collectible fabric they are today. And bonus, she learned to sew on a treadle sewing machine too. Lindsay, welcome to my studio. I'm so glad you could join me.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
I first was introduced to your work by one of my dear friends, and you have designed fabric lines, so she had some of those, but what really caught my attention was your book on Feedsacks. So you know I'm going to talk about that today. But before we dive into some of the current things, maybe give me a brief look at how you were introduced to quilting and how that became part of your life.
Okay. Well, my mom taught me to sew. She was an amazing seamstress, sewist, and she was very, very good at sewing clothing. She was very construction oriented. And so she took couture classes and millinery classes and was very into clothing and taught me to sew. But I was not that construction oriented, I'm not as detail oriented as she was. And so she and I would butt heads. She had a really amazing Necki sewing machine from Germany that she was very careful of, and I was not that careful. And so she ultimately bought me a treadle for $10 at a garage sale, and that was what I sewed on when I was young. And when I graduated from college, she gave me a sewing machine, a little Singer, and I made curtains and that sort of thing, but nothing too, spectacular. And I went back to graduate school when I was 40 and got a degree in journalism. And I got a job at the University of Iowa as a writer and editor. And I walked into one of my colleagues' rooms one day, and she had this quilt hanging on the back of her chair. And I said, "Oh, that's beautiful. Where did you get it?" And she said, "I made it." And I said, "Well, I've always wanted to learn to quilt. I always, through all of this, loved fabric and color." And she said, "Well, come over this weekend." And I was
Nothing
like,
like
okay. So she was a young woman, younger than I, which was unusual, and for a quilter at that point. So I went over, and this was, how long ago was this? Maybe in the early, I've been quilting, more than 20 years, I guess now, but
Okay.
Not a whole lot more. And I went over, I learned to quilt. I loved it. I went crazy. I made, 8 quilts my first year and finished them and was just having the time of my life. And my job at the university was fun, but some things where I get bored easily, and I was looking for some other challenges. And my daughter's roommate's best friend's sister was an editor at American Patchwork and Quilting. And I decided to contact her and see if she was interested in having me doing some writing for her. And she was. My very first profile was in Quilts and More of Amy Butler. And I've written for them ever since, those magazines. And that's how my career in writing about textiles sort of got started, and when I started quilting. So.
Okay. That all makes sense. Now, see, I didn't see you in those magazines. I'll go look for them now that I know that. My first introduction, as I said, was your wonderful book on Feedsacks. Okay, so when did Feedsacks kind of enter the picture?
So I was trying to go back and think about that. It must have been somewhere around 2013. A man named Mike Zaz came to our guild. And Mike is from a little town of Ainsworth, Iowa, near here. I live in Iowa City, Iowa. And he had this amazing collection of Feedsacks and huge knowledge of Feedsacks. And I had never heard of them. I grew up in California, which doesn't mean anything necessarily, because Feedsacks were found in all 50 states, but I didn't know anything about them. And so I was just fascinated. I was just amazed. And at the time I was blogging for Etsy, and this was before most people even knew what Etsy was. And I was very sad. Just the other day, I went to look for one of my blog posts, and they've all been taken off. But I did that for 3 years. I got more than 200 comments for the post about Feedsacks. And I thought, well, gosh, I'm not the only person who's interested in Feedsacks. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing more and more research. And at the same time, I was a contributing writer, and have been for a very long time, at Uppercase magazine. And I don't know if you're familiar with Uppercase, but she does beautiful magazine, has a beautiful quarterly magazine and books. And so I wrote to her and said, let's do a book about Feedsacks. And she said, well, I love Feedsacks. That's a great idea, but I'm pretty busy right now. Let's think about it in the future. So in the meantime, the University of Iowa Press approached me about doing a book about quilts. And they said, you could do whatever you wanted. What kind of ideas do you have? And so I came up with the idea for a book called Art Quilts of the Midwest. And I can talk about that some if we want to. But
Sure.
So they had a traditional quilt book published and they wanted something a little different. I'm a Californian who's transplanted to Iowa. And one of the things that I have always noticed is that my color sense was a little bit different from my friends who were from the Midwest. I always gravitated towards sort of blues and greens and purples, and they were much more earth tones. That was sort of what their thing was. And so I started thinking about how the idea of how where you grow up influences your visual aesthetic. And so I opened a competition for art quilters to submit quilts that were influenced by life in the Midwest. And we had more than 100 entries, and we selected 20. I had a committee with 2 artists and myself, and we selected 20. And then I wrote profiles of them, and the book was published. And it became the basis of several exhibitions as well. But anyway, so I did that. And then next, Janine said, the publisher at Uppercase said, okay, I'm ready. Let's do this book. And so we did the Feedsack book. So those 2 books happened pretty closely together. But they were both big adventures.
Well, I highly recommend the Feedsack book. It's as good as sitting down to read a novel, honestly. It's filled, of course, with photographs of fabrics and of people and places and advertisements and all these things. But just the stories that are in there are so rich. I cannot imagine the level of research to find all those stories. Did you get to handle a lot of those different Feedsacks? You must have if you were photographing them.
Well, so the story of how we photographed all those Feedsacks is kind of interesting. So this was 2015, I think, when we were putting this together. And Mike Zaz had this amazing collection of Feedsacks, but he was in the middle of being filmed for a documentary, which is a long story and very interesting, called Saving Brinton, if you ever want to look it up. So his Feedsacks were not available. So we had to find someone who would let us photograph their Feedsacks, because I had 7 at that point.
Hardly enough for a book. Close. But
Hardly. My goal was to approach this as a journalist, not as a collector. I subsequently have changed. I have a ton of Feedsacks now. But anyway, so we had to find someone with a big collection. So I started putting out feelers and eventually learned about Gloria. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on Gloria's last name, who was from Palmyra, Nebraska. And she was a Feedsack expert. She had an amazing collection. Her grandson, Paul Pugsley, also had an amazing collection. And she said, sure, come on and photograph these Feedsacks. So Janine, who is in Calgary, Canada, and I spent, I think, something like a week or maybe 10 days, I don't know, total. That was all we were together. The rest of it was all done online, photographing Gloria's Feedsack, Gloria Hall. And it was amazing. We walked into her house and she had these huge long tables set up, piled with sacks.
Oh my goodness.
And then she had another whole room that was quilts and Feedsack ephemera. And we spent 2 days there. She made us BLTs for lunch, and she lived out in the country, and we just used our iPhones and we photographed all the sacks for the books. There are others that were from other collections, but that was the majority of what we used in the images. And I should say there are 850 images in the book. I mean, it's really a visual treat. I thank you for your kind words about the writing, but the visuals are incredible.
They
and Janine,
absolutely are.
Yeah, she gets credit for that design.
My favorite coffee table book. Okay, so for our listeners who maybe don't yet know what Feedsacks are, maybe just want to know more about them, give us a brief, if you can, a couple paragraphs.
Sure.
History of Feedsacks and why they came to be used, and maybe even what some of the steps were that women took to salvage this fabric.
So in the late 1800s, in the mid 1800s, the sewing machine became perfected, where you had a lock stitch sewing machine. And before that, goods were shipped in barrels and boxes, and that were bulky. They took up a lot of space even when they were empty. And so when sacks could be constructed thanks to the sewing machine, and also thanks to the plethora of cotton we had in this country at that time. And that was due largely to slavery. We had, cheap labor, and we had a huge amount of cotton being produced. And so that was sort of this perfect storm where bags became the choice to ship goods. And when we say feed sacks, you think we're talking about animal feed, and there was animal feed, but there was everything was shipped in sacks. Sugar, flour, salt, animal feed, animal seed, hams, ballots, money. We've seen money bags. Bags used to be used for every kind of thing to ship. I have a wonderful bag that had a little label sewn into the bottom of it, a paper label which was an address label, and it's auto parts, like ship your auto parts in this bag. So really, bags were used for everything. And the academic name for them, people call them cotton commodity bags. There are all kinds of names: chicken pretties, chicken linen pretties, all sorts of things they're called depending on what was in them. So they were at first plain. They didn't have anything on them. Then logos were, except possibly a logo was stamped on them of the company or what they contained. And then in the 1920s, manufacturers started realizing that women were using this as free fabric, and they started trying to make it more desirable. So they started doing things like printing embroidery patterns on them. And think about the classic days of the week dish towels, Monday through Sunday. And you would say to your husband, and often these were rural women, not all at all, but many, and you'd say, go back to the feed store and get me Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday because I have the rest. So it also became a real way to market to women, which is something that hadn't been done a lot. And so they kept trying to make their bags more desirable and more desirable. And in the late 30s, there were some printed bags before the late 30s, but in 1930s, they didn't really catch on. In 1937, the Percy Kent Bag Company is credited with producing the first printed sacks. And those printed sacks went on probably until the early 60s, 63 or 64. And there have been documented more than 18,000 different prints and colorways of feed sacks.
Wow.
So that's the story of them. And then they were used for everything.
Just reading your book was eye-opening for me because I thought of them as kind of 30s style prints, the small scale, the usually floral, right, that sort of thing. But from the pictures in your book, I see that they come in just an amazing amount. I mean, Mexican ones and nature ones and plaid ones and just everything under the sun. So that was kind of enlightening for me to see the huge variety. And of course, all these different printing companies would have had artists for the sole purpose, I'm sure, of designing those.
Yes, that's true. And I think they very much tried to follow the fabric style of the times. So just like you're saying, you think of them as being the sweet little things, but at the 50s, they're kind of coming back around now. Geometric and the atomic age and all of that. There are very, very contemporary, modern sort of feed sack prints too. In addition to florals, I think florals were popular all along. And then there were also special, they licensed Walt Disney. There were Alice in Wonderland sacks. There's a story, and I don't know if this is true, the Gone with the Wind sacks. They made Gone with the Wind feed sacks, and apparently every 4 months they would issue them in a new colorway so that people who had one would then want the other one. So they really, again, the marketing to women. And it's one of the things I love, because I love that manufacturers realized that women might not have been earning the paycheck, but they had a lot of say in where the family dollar was spent.
Yes.
And so they marketed to them,
Yes.
And I love that.
And found their kind of pressure points is not quite the right word, but the ways that would reach out to them. And I think of feed sacks a lot of time as flour sacks. That's how my grandmother would have collected them. And yeah, just like you say, they were looking for different days of the week, or maybe they were looking for blues. And my grandpa would walk into a feed store and there would be this wall, of sacks, and he would literally scan them for the blue that that his wife was looking for. And they just found those little sweet spots. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the steps that ladies had to take, though, to make this fabric usable? I know over time the sack producing companies made them a little, more easy to use, but early on,
Right.
this was out of desperate need that women were using these fabrics, and it was not easy. You didn't just rip open the side seam and start sewing your dress out of it. What were some of the steps involved?
Well, if you were making a dress, for one thing, you had to have enough to make a dress. So, for example, the average size woman's dress was 4 sacks. I met a woman, Lisa Erlinson, in Texas, who told me that one of the ultimate insults at her high school was to say that someone was a 6-sacker or a 5-sacker, which is terrible but funny. Yeah, so you had to find you had to find the right number of a single print. And you mentioned people going for blues. I interviewed a lot of people who said they would send a swatch. Their mom would send a swatch to the store with their dad saying, get me more of these, you have to find this same print. And so that was the first step, although there are certainly things you could make with 1 sack too, children's clothes and that sort of thing. And then the other thing, I think probably what you're thinking about too, are the labels. The labels for what was inside were often printed right on the sacks with, big heavy ink. And getting that out to make the sack usable was really hard work. And there are all sorts of stories about, that right on the sack, sometimes they would print the instructions for how to use them, how to rip them open, because they were that sort of thread that you pulled a thread and the whole thing came loose.
Yes.
And then how to get the label off. And they included things like scrubbing it with kerosene and lye and things that were really hard on your hands.
No kidding.
And there's even a Southern folklore that if you scrubbed your sack's label by the light of a full moon, it would come out more easily.
Good luck with that.
Right. So eventually, again, trying to make their sacks more desirable, they figured out that you could put a paper label. And so they would either sew the label into the seam when they sewed the bag up or glue it right on. And then that label could be removed by soaking, that kind of thing. So that was another improvement to appeal to women.
Yes, so incredibly much easier. I just, again, in reading your book and from my limited knowledge about Feedsacks, I am always overwhelmed by the tenacity of these women who saw a resource. And, in the 30s and 40s, there was a whole lot of need and they found a way. And to me, that's the spirit that I love that lives on in quilters. This tenacity, finding a way to make a thing out of what you've got.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree, Susan. To me, that's the big appeal. I mean, I love the fabrics, I love the prints, I love the colors, but I just love the stories of the women who use them. And, these women who had like 6 kids and they grew all their own vegetables and they raised the chickens and they sewed all the clothes. One of my favorite stories, I can't remember the woman's name who told me, but she remembers her mother saying, okay, you need a new dress, get the Sears catalog. And it's not that she was going to get a dress out of the Sears catalog, but she could pick the style of dress that she liked. And then once she's done that, her mother would look at it, make up a paper pattern out of newspaper and lay it out on Feedsacks and make her that dress. I mean, the talent too, the skill is amazing.
Yes. High level of skill.
Yeah.
So you are not just a Feedsack lover. You also love vintage quilts. You love carpets. Tell us some more about some of the other textiles that you've fallen in love with.
I do love rugs. I have a number of rugs in my house, but I just have always loved textiles. My mom she had really great taste and she loved decorating her house. And so I grew up surrounded by lovely textiles and getting an appreciation. My grandmother also had traveled the world and she had textiles from all over the world in her summer cabin. And I think that's where I got my love of them. I do try very hard not to collect vintage quilts, although that doesn't always hold up. But I bought one last weekend, as a matter of fact. But yes, I do enjoy vintage quilts. I usually try to make them. I give a lot of talks about Feedsacks, and so I try to collect within that category of Feedsack quilts. But I also, another thing that I've been doing, it started with the Art Quilts of the Midwest book, is curating museum exhibits. And so that the Art Quilts of the Midwest went to 4 quilt museums. It started at the International Quilt Museum and went to the National Quilt Museum in Paducah and Iowa Quilt Museum. And
that
Texas
was originally
Quilt
a book, and then it became an exhibit? Companion
yes.
kind of? Okay, got it.
Yes. Yeah. And that was not anything I ever intended, but I got to be friends with well, you guys probably have heard of Marianne Fons, and she was very instrumental in getting the Iowa Quilt Museum started. And that turned out to be the second. It was kind of a ready-made exhibit because I'd already written the catalog, basically.
Right.
Right. So I mentioned that because I do collect I then have curated a show on string piece quilts, which is another topic that really, again, like you were saying, Susan, those people who really used everything up and didn't waste. It's that same sort of thing I admire. And so I have bought a few string piece quilts, a few Feedsack quilts, and that exhibit, by the way, started at the Iowa Quilt Museum and it's going to be at the New England Quilt Museum in April through July.
Is it coming west at all? Anywhere near me? I'm, way over in Washington.
Well, there is a quilt museum there, right?
Not to my knowledge.
No.
Maybe in Portland, maybe in Seattle, but I live on the eastern side of my state. Okay. So yeah, there's
one
really
thing I would say is quilts are really having a moment right now. I think, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Chicago Art Institute have had shows recently. So hopefully something will come your way.
I hope so too.
But yeah.
So I have a question for you because I too love all things vintage, but because I'm a long arm quilter, I tend to look for, and now my battery's running low. Okay, hang on a second.
Oh, that's yours. Okay.
Yep, that's mine. I'm going to run around and jiggle the wire because it is plugged in. 1 sec.
Okay. Having everything reversed on the screen.
Yeah, I know. It messes with your head, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start that question over again. So I have a question for you. I too love all things vintage, but because I'm a long arm quilter, I tend to look for vintage tops or blocks that have never been finished. What are some tips for what to look for in the fabrics? Like if I want to have some that contain feed sacks, what do I look for?
So the best way that you can tell if a feed sack is a feed sack is to actually find the stitching holes. Find a piece of fabric with the stitching holes still on it. And they tend to persevere even through many washings. And you'll often see a curve where the corner is. And a piece of feed sack fabric is about 43 by 36 inches, somewhere in there is about the size. But obviously you're probably not going to find that if it's pieced into a top. Right. So there are a number of ways to do it. I think that sometimes you'll find the stitching holes in a seam. Very frugal sewists would make sure to use every last bit, and so those holes would be in the seam. That too is a little bit unusual. People often think that feed sacks have a loose texture, a loose weave, but that's not always true because you mentioned flour. Obviously if you put flour in something with a loose weave, it's all going to come out. So a lot of the feed sack fabric is flour sack, sugar sack, salt sack is very tightly woven and is comparable to dress goods. So that's not necessarily always a way to tell. One of the best ways is to look at a lot of feed sacks. And I remember when I started this, Gloria Hall, the person who I mentioned her collection, could just look at something and say, oh, that's a feed sack, that's a feed sack. And I didn't understand. And I'm not always right, but I often can do that now from having looked at many, many feed sacks. So I think one of the most common things that irritates me is I see things advertised as feed sack all the time, like this is a feed sack top, and they're usually 1930s dress print fabrics.
Interesting.
People
passing
often
off as feed sacks.
Yes, which are, well, I think people think they are, but they're often little, ditzy prints, small florals and juvenile prints and all of that kind of thing.
It's maybe a term that we quilters use a bit loosely to describe a type of print more than the actual feed sacking.
That could be too. So. Yeah. So.
All right. So on the heels of that now then, and this is a little while back already, you designed one, maybe more, correct me if I'm wrong, lines of fabric that are based on feed sack prints.
Right. So this is sort of one of the stories of my career is that I've just been very lucky in that, and also I've gotten very brave that I'm not afraid to ask things. So I started writing for American Patchworking, or for Quilts and More, and then that wrote for them. And then I approached an edit. One of the stories I wrote for Etsy, they asked me to go to Quilt Market. And that was this wonderful chance to get to see the industry from the inside. And so I said, sure, I'll go. And wrote a story about that for them. And in the meantime, one of the people that I was supposed to write about was Lisa Alexander, who was the marketing manager, an amazing person, wonderful person for Moda Fabrics. And I didn't know her at the time, but I was at Quilt Market and I was supposed to write this profile. So I thought I'll go talk to her. And at that point, she said, would you ever write for us? And I said, sure. And I started writing for Moda in something like 2000, I don't know, a long time ago, 2010, maybe more than that. And writing profiles for them and writing catalog copy and writing for their blog. And so I got to know people at Moda over the years. And actually, when I did my Feedsack book, one of the people I interviewed was Cheryl Freidberg, who was the design director then and for many, many decades at Moda, and super knowledgeable about fabric. And Moda also has a great collection of their own fabric. They have a little fabric library room.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So she knew all about them. So I interviewed a lot of people, contemporary people like Cheryl, also to find out where Feedsacks fit in, because as you mentioned, contemporary quilters love them still. So she knew about the book, and I took her a copy. I gave everyone I interviewed a copy. And I have a daughter in Austin, Texas. And so I often drive down every year to see her. And so I had stopped at Moda and taken Cheryl her copy. And the next day she emailed me and said, would you want to design a line of fabric based on Feedsacks? And, to be honest, it's nothing I ever thought I would do. I write about people who are creative because I just love it. Kind of what you're saying about having a podcast, that you get to talk to interesting people. And that's exactly why I write the things that I do. So I never intended for that to happen, but it's been a very exciting adventure. My fifth line is out right now. It's called Morning Light. I think the yardage just hit the stores yesterday. It's been very much fun. And then along those lines, a good friend who lived down the street and I started Clark Street Quilts, designing patterns. And she's going to finally step down, but that's been she's got the math mind. I do not. So we're a very good team. I mean, she's an amazing quilter and has wonderful design sense also. But so that's another thing that's happened along the way that I hadn't counted on happening, but has been very much fun too. So
opportunities.
I've enjoyed it.
I love that.
Right.
I love that.
Right.
So you did mention very briefly that a collection that you've curated is going to New England. Did you say that? Any other things that are on the horizon that our listeners could be looking for over the next few weeks or months?
Yes. Well, on my website, I do have a list of my talks. And one of the ones that's coming up on March 19th, and this is, you could come to my talk, but also do not miss this exhibit. The Ken Burns Quilt Collection is going to be in Peoria, Illinois at the Riverfront Museum there. And they're doing a lot of quilt programming in conjunction with it. So I'll be giving a talk on March 19th.
And how long does that run? Because this podcast may not be out yet then, and people will be very sad if it's over. How long does the exhibit run?
It's just opening. So I cannot tell you how long, but it literally opened, I think, last week. Okay. So it'll be there for some months.
So we're talking in March right now. So we'll put links to that in the show notes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the string theory, it's called String Theory Quilts of the Past and Present. I can't remember the exact title, but it was at the Iowa Quilt Museum, and it's going to be traveling to the New England Quilt Museum. And that will be from April to July. And then I have several talks lined up. Also, they're listed on my website. Usually most people are interested in hearing about Feedsacks. So I do go out and talk about Feedsacks, and I take a lot of samples with me and share them. And my favorite thing about it is people also bring their, I've had so many people bring the dress they wore as a baby that their mother made out of Feedsacks, or, it's just, I love the stories that I get to hear. It's funny, when I first started writing the book, people said to me, oh, you're going to have trouble. People hated Feedsacks. They threw out their Feedsack quilts because they were a sign of poverty and people didn't want to remember those hard times. And I did find one person like that, but almost everyone else was so delighted to talk to me about it. And it's like that story I told you about the woman whose mother made those dresses for her. I think that the women I talk to are mostly the children of the women who were working so hard and making the Feedsack dresses. And so they have these fond memories of these dresses their mothers made for them, or the hard work their mothers did. And also, I found that most of them, their friends, were also wearing Feedsack dresses. So it wasn't like they were singled out, as being poor and having to wear sack dresses. So no, there's a lot of fondness for sacks, which is lovely.
And it is just such a remarkable tribute. I mean, I can see how people would view it as, the use of cotton as a nod to slavery, or just a reminder of the poverty that existed in those years. But it is also such a tribute to the resilience of the human spirit to move forward, to make the best of the situation that you're in. It's remarkable.
I agree. And I think one thing that's really interesting, I've found there's a lot of interest among younger sewists in Feedsacks. And I think it's because there's this real recognition of our need for sustainability now.
Right.
And that was very much a way of repurposing, that they see as having contemporary relevance. So
absolutely. I mean, that is always admirable, using a thing for more than one reason. Yeah. All right. So before we go, I wondered if you'd have some little gem of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners. It can be about, opportunities, or about your craft, or about life in general, whatever you like, a little thought you'd like to leave with us.
I think for me, and I think it's really true for everyone else, that sometimes it's hard to see the end point of what you're doing or where you're going. But my whole career in textiles has been one thing leading to another. And I think that as you grow and develop and change and learn new things, you're adding skills and awareness and knowledge, and all of those things build on each other. So I think, and even if it's something you do that you don't like, well, that's important to know too. I'll never make a Dresden plate. I couldn't stand it. But, I think that everything you do, everyone you meet, it can lead to other opportunities. And I think the thing to remember too is to say yes to them, to not think, oh, I'm not good enough, I can't do that, but to say yes to those opportunities, because who knows where it will lead.
Great advice. Thank you for that. And thanks so much for joining me. This has been a real pleasure to hear your stories.
Thank you, Susan. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you, my friends, for tuning into the show. If you enjoyed this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcast or the listening app of your choice? And do share this episode with your friends as well. It really helps other listeners to find the show so they can enjoy these stories too. Plus, I would love to hear from listeners who'd like to nominate a crafter with a story to tell. If you know such a person, or you are one, email me at info@stitchedbysusan.com. So until next time, may your sorrows be patched and your joys be quilted.